land versus block land when you're building an array. And it has to do fundamentally with the fact that all NFS servers, if you think about it, they kind of boot, they see devices, then they start the file system, then they start services, and then those services are creating exports, right? So that the process of failure usually involves some combination of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and there's no proper multipathing in NFS as it is, which means that you can't just fail over to a separate target to use a different port. So something of control.
Yeah, and some failure behavior you can do through link aggregation type stuff. So if it's a port failure or a network switch failure, if you've done it right. And the danger that I often see is, for some reason, people approach NAS-based deployments with less discipline than they do block-based deployments. And if you're deploying them for VMware, you have to have the same degree of discipline about design. There's a session that we're doing, TA8133, right, which is all about like HA design of storage subsystems. And I have to say, a lot of people that use NAS are so used to the NAS data store being easy. Man, they just put it like on the service console or the management port, right? And because it's so easy to just do, hey, look, I'll mount the data store. It's up and running, and then before you know it, they're actually putting VMs on there that matter without the discipline that should go into how do you do the design. But you're right on the second point, which is, right now it's NFS v3 only. So there's very important best practices out there that we try to be as explicit as we can about, which says no matter how you configure link aggregation type models, a data store will always exit using one Ethernet interface and enter into the NFS server using one Ethernet interface, a MAC address, right? There can be failover behaviors and stuff like that, but while they're running, it'll always only use one. I find customer after customer after customer thinks that they can use link aggregation and drive the bandwidth to a single NFS data store across a whole bunch of different VMK NICs, and it does not work that way. For what it's worth, again, speaking as, and again, I'm not VMware, but everybody who's here speaking has to follow very explicit what you can say and what you can't say, and stuff that you can't say you have to use special code language for. Future vSphere releases will have updates to the NFS client.
You posted on that.
So, and even there, I tap danced around it, right?
Not the chef now.
So, get me drunk afterwards and we can talk about it.
But things around NFS, is it 4 distributed?
So NFS 4 introduces the idea of multiple sessions per connection, which would allow you to have multiple logins, which actually would drive a lot of benefit, right? Which would allow you to drive path behavior across multiple links. It would allow you to do certain things. NFS 4.1 actually would be the one that gets you the most stuff. And then there's this PNFS thing, which is interesting in other ways, for other types of use cases. But none of that stuff is real now. Some people actually use it within guests, though. That's one thing that's funky, right? You can actually, there's use cases where it's useful to do an NFS mount inside a guest, at which point you could actually use NFS clients that are richer than the VM kernel implementation of the NFS. But at that point, guys, you're breaking encapsulation, which in general is bad, right? And things like Site Recovery Manager and stuff like that start to get funky. So there was another.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in NFS 4, does it actually have multi-targets so that you can have separate IPs all aggregated to generate bandwidth, but also...
So in NFS 4.1, the answer is yes, right? And then there's the other developments. I tried to allude to this in one of the sessions where I go, we're working on future NFS and PNFS type thing. PNFS and global file systems are two separate ideas, right? A global file system or a distributed file system is a file system that exists on multiple servers at once, that in theory you could use parallel, NFS or NFS v4.1 to kind of get aggregated in, but you could also spread it out across lots of brains and have it be very HA. PNFS on its own also says, well, it's possible to decouple how you ask for information, in other words, give me this file, versus how it actually gets to you, so that the channel for the request could be separate from the channel for delivery. So in other words, it's a weird idea, but but you could actually ask for something using NAS and have it delivered via block, right? Or actually ask for it via NAS and deliver it via NAS, or ask for it via NAS and have it delivered to you via object storage models. So it's actually a way where there's a unified way of accessing information that's separate from how it's delivered. Because the other thing that is different is even in NFS 4.1, the multipathing behavior still doesn't have the same degree of set up all the paths always in advance. Like MPIO, which is used for block storage models, has the idea of like, I create a session all in advance and I know about all paths all in advance, such that if I lose a path, the path handling behavior can be extremely predictable, right? But I think that over time there's going to be more and more convergence between NAS and block models, just as a general statement. Okay, unless there's any other questions on that one, let's keep on trucking. I think that we need to encourage people to explore both. More and more, VMware's trying to drive towards feature parity, right? But by the way, when some people ask, why is storage I/O control, block only in vSphere 4.1, that's actually not. Sometimes stuff is just there's no bandwidth for QA, but it works. But sometimes it doesn't actually work right, and that's a case where it doesn't work entirely right on NFS-based data stores. It's not supported. But that's a reflection of the earlier survey that we saw, which is the bulk of the customers tend to be dominated by fiber still. Right? So that creates weird prioritization decisions within VMware as they go through the process. Okay, next question. By the way, I asked this survey question on Virtual Geek, and Virtual Geek's got all sorts of leadership, right? They're not all EMCers, they're people from all over the place. This is the distribution. So this is fiber, this is iSCSI, this is DAS, this is FCOE, this is NFS. The one thing that was mind-blowing to me is I asked the question, how many of you use more than one protocol? Basically, if you add together, I use 2 or 3, excluding DAS, right? That's the majority. Now, the Virtual Geek readership is a little skewed towards people that read blogs, right? So they tend to be a little, more techno-phily. So they're like, I'll play with everything, right? Then customers tend to be more like, I'd like to, just be focused on that. Okay, cool. Okay, which one of these is the most frustrating for you today? It's hard to read. I am the storage team, and storage is frustrating. Configuring storage is frustrating. In other words, I own it, and I'm frustrated. This one is, I work with the storage team, and storage is frustrating. In other words, I don't actually do it, but working with the people who do it is frustrating. That's 2. 3 is dealing with the cost of storage. Storage outages. 5 is how much we're using or we're going to use in the future. In other words, figure out capacity and utilization. Performance problems. In other words, I'm having performance problems. Figuring out the relationships between VMs and storage is frustrating for me. Multipathing or networking. I know about tons of coolness that's possible, we just don't use it. And other. Does that make sense? This is a long list. They told me, Chad, don't ask so many questions that makes people confused. But I'm like, come on, it's VMworld, they're smart. They can answer 10 questions. So we're at 17. If you want a clarification on what I mean by them, you can ask, but it's really what you think I mean, right? Okay, good. Let's see. Survey says, okay, so basically the majority say, I know about tons of coolness that's possible, but I just don't use it. So sad, but so true. Like literally, again, I'm going to say this in the EMC sense, but I bet you it's happening in every storage vendor on the planet, right? Half of the discussions from the product perspective is we're like, we have made so much stuff that people can't consume because it's too hard or there's too many obstacles or, whatever. And the horrific reality is that people buy arrays from us and everybody else that are unbelievably sophisticated and then use them like they're JBOD. Right? Right? Which drives us crazy. We work hard to make this stuff cool. It seems like the next major winner is 6, performance problems. So what are the kind of performance problems that you guys see?
I'll see guys that say, hey, we've got a hot FA, what's burning us up here? And then we've got a million windows of ESX top. trying to figure out what's coming from
What is generating a hot FA?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get the vSphere guys and the storage guys on the same page.
Yeah, what else do you guys see? Or is it all kind of like that?
I see a lot of customers just dumping all the virtual machines wherever there's space, no matter how much time you spend telling them how the design of the storage system is.
Well, the problem that I often see is, like, even if it's designed pristinely from day one, what occurs afterwards is literally like, oh, create a VM and I'll just stick it wherever. There's enough capacity on data store A.
And another thing that stems from that is a lot of application vendors simply just say, we don't want virtualization because we haven't got any guarantees about time slots or performance and storage and stuff like that. So whenever we start up, basically primarily Exchange servers, SQL servers, virtualizing, then we have to take the discussion with the stupid vendors, telling them this here will actually work.
You know, and the funny thing is that even our own. So here's an interesting thing, right? So if you go to the sessions on application design on VMware here at VMworld, they still have storage designs for those applications, which are very much reflections of what the best practices were when they were physical. In other words, put the logs here on a RAID 10, volume, and put the database over here on this, separate and isolated,
array.
Right, and we're having a lot of internal discussions, which is those are actually good best practices, particularly as you move up towards the Uber scale, right? But frankly, everyone's storage arrays these days, like, there's a little bit of a secret, right? Which is, even though you think your data is there, it's actually like blammed out all over the place, right? In the same way that VMware has kind of forced people to go, like, let go of the fact that you don't have that one-to-one CPU to app mapping. All storage is pretty virtualized these days from pretty well every vendor, right? You know what I mean? So all of these best practices are a reflection of, like, the 1990s. It's no longer true, but the app vendors just refuse to.
Yeah, and also they cannot come up with any specific demands on how many IOPS they need, how much crucial, how much bandwidth, stuff like that. They just say it cannot run on any virtual hardware when you download a physical box.
Yeah.
And if there's just the slightest mistake, and even if they themselves are fucked up, sorry for my language, still the virtual.
I hear you, brother.
so many software issues being solved by just adding better hardware, and that frustrates me.
It is frustrating. I mean, so, like, what's the number one way to improve a SQL or Oracle performance issue?
Knowing whatever you're doing.
The answer is application query optimization, right? Right? What's the number one thing that people do to try and improve?
Add more
SQL?
RAM.
Add more hardware, starting with RAM, right? So it's because the brute force thing is simple, right? It's basic. It doesn't require genius, and there are a million vendors who are more than happy to sell you something, right? The knowledge is the most difficult asset to have, right? So the other one that is a big standout seems to be number 7, the relationships between VMs and storage. I have to say, one thing that I'm really bummed out by, just perpetually, right, is how few customers use the vCenter plugins, right? I mean, look, we've got them. But so does pretty well every major storage vendor under the sun now, right? They have varying degrees of capability, but every single one of them will show you the relationship between storage and VMs.
Yeah, but is that possible in every organization? I mean, if we, for example, if I look to my own organization, we have different pillars with different expertise. So you have a storage team, for example, and you have a Wintel team, a Unix team, and also a virtualization team. Cooperation between those pillars is, from all days, it's difficult. It's getting less and less difficult, but it's still, it has still a few humps in the way. So if, for example, if I want to use a plugin from a storage vendor, and I need to talk to the array on the other side, there are a few guys, including the security officers, to say like, okay, what would you be doing there? It's not your job to do storage, so